I knew something in me broke the night I realized my husband wanted his dying stepfather gone and counted on me to finish the job. My name is Natalie Rivera, and I still hear Daniel's voice trembling in the dark as he whispered, "Don't let them see I'm still alive." That was the moment I understood. The man I loved wasn't just cheating on me. He was waiting for someone he claimed to care about to die. And somehow, he expected me to be part of it. By the time I reached the edge of Denver, the snow was falling so hard it blurred the world into white streaks. 2 months of mountain duty had left my body exhausted, but all I could think about was stepping into a warm house, dropping my bags, and finally breathing again. I kept picturing Mason waiting inside, maybe annoyed I was late, but still there, still home. That hope cracked the moment I pulled into the driveway. No porch light, no shadows moving behind the curtains, no smell of anything cooking for the holiday weekend. The silence hit me first, wide, hollow, wrong. When I opened the door, a blast of cold spilled out like the house exhaled after holding its breath too long. It didn't feel empty. It felt abandoned. Mason's jacket was missing from its usual place on the hook. The living room sat in a strange stillness, untouched, as if time had stopped without warning. Then I saw the shape in the recliner. Daniel sat curled into himself, shoulders shaking, lips pale, eyes glassy with confusion. I rushed to him on instinct, checking his pulse, his skin temperature, the dryness of his mouth. Everything in my training told me the same thing. He'd been left like this far too long. The fridge offered nothing but a few packets of sour sauce and a bottle of water turned half to ice. On the counter, a crumpled note waited like an accusation. "Natalie, we went to Palm Springs for a few days. Daniel's been too much. Handle it for us. M and Mom." I stared at it as my stomach dropped, the cold in the house seeping straight into my bones. Whatever Thanksgiving was supposed to be, it had already collapsed. When I turned back, Daniel's hand lifted weakly, catching my sleeve. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Don't let them see I'm still alive. They don't want that." And just like that, a door I'd never meant to open swung wide, revealing something far darker waiting behind it. Daniel's pulse fluttered under my fingers, thin and irregular, the way a body sounds when it's been running on empty for far too long. His skin was cool, muscles shrunken, lips cracked from dehydration. Every EMS instinct in me said the same thing. This wasn't new. This was the result of days, maybe weeks of being ignored. On the table beside him sat a bottle that should have held his cancer pain meds. The label was right, but the pills were a cheap vitamin blend. I twisted the cap off, inhaled, and felt my stomach tighten. Someone had swapped them intentionally. Daniel watched me with a look that carried both apology and exhaustion. His voice was barely a rasp as he murmured that he had become a burden, that Linda wanted him to sign something. I didn't ask what yet. Instead, I warmed water, put soup on the stove, and cleaned him up bit by bit, trying to give him back any comfort he had been denied. While I worked, he talked, quietly, slowly, about the Hale family's fractures. He told me how the Wyoming Bridge project had gone wrong, and how quickly Linda had shifted blame onto him, insisting he take responsibility to shield her decisions. How she'd repeated that someone had to bear the fallout, and she'd simply decided it should be him. He spoke of Mason, too, how he'd grown distant, reckless with money, quick to anger over nothing. Later, when I threw away some trash, I spotted crumpled receipts from upscale restaurants, charged to our shared card on nights I'd been sleeping in the back of an ambulance. The sight made something inside me bend, then splinter. When I returned to Daniel, adjusting his blanket, a tiny metal key slipped from the pocket of his old housecoat. I picked it up, unsure what it belonged to. He opened his eyes just enough to speak. "Someone wants me to take the blame, but the fault was never mine." His words were thin as smoke, but they lingered like a warning. The storm rattled the windows as I headed down to the basement for the spare heater. The moment I opened the door, the air changed. Thicker, colder, dust heavy enough to taste. Boxes leaned on each other like they hadn't been touched in years. But in the far corner sat a metal safe, out of place in the chaos. I tried the small key. It turned with a tired click. Inside were folders packed tight, the original engineering plans for the Wyoming Bridge, handwritten notes about structural issues, and printed emails warning of risk. Every one addressed to Linda. Every warning brushed aside. Beneath them lay Daniel's life insurance paperwork. His signature was there, but wrong, angled, trembling. The kind of mark a man makes when he's pressured or barely conscious. A vibration upstairs pulled me back. On the tablet Mason left behind, a preview lit up the screen. Him with a younger woman at a desert bar, her arm around his neck. My breath hitched, but anger steadied me. I opened our shared account, charges from Palm Springs, Las Vegas, Desert Club, all while I was away. Then a message thread appeared. Mason to Linda. Let him be. If he goes this week, everything aligns. The words knocked the air from my lungs. Aligns. They weren't just waiting for Daniel to die. They were planning around it. I stepped back into the living room, emotion burning behind my ribs. Daniel stirred, lifting his hand just enough for me to take it. You're the one I trust, not them. His voice was faint, yet it struck with the force of truth I could no longer unsee. The documents from the basement were still spread across the table when I realized I needed something irrefutable. Proof that Daniel hadn't just been neglected, but intentionally left to fade. I turned to Mason's laptop, the one he used to brag about leaving open because spouses shouldn't hide anything. His old password still worked. The screen loaded to an unsent email from Linda. Don't call me again. You have to let Daniel choose his own timing. We can't drag this out anymore. The words chilled me more than the storm. I checked the doorbell camera, hoping I'd misread the message. Instead, I watched video of Mason and Linda walking Daniel outside in nothing but his thin sleepwear, setting him on the porch as freezing air whipped around him. They shut the door and drove off. My body tightened with disbelief so sharp it felt physical. I forced myself to keep digging. In the desk drawer, stacks of receipts revealed a trail of expensive dinners, hotel stays, and bar tabs, paid for with our shared card. I tried calling Mason, but my call was dismissed with a canned response that felt like mockery. A new picture feed appeared on his tablet seconds later. Mason in a desert bar, a young woman leaning against him like she belonged there. She posted a story soon after, with my guy again in Palm Springs. He said he'll be free soon. Free. He was planning a life without me, while I was hauling strangers out of burning buildings. My hands shook as I opened Daniel's insurance file. The beneficiary had been updated 4 weeks earlier, right when I'd left for deployment, naming Mason alone. I called Helen for guidance. Her voice sharpened when I explained everything. Did they leave him alone in the cold house? When I said yes, she exhaled heavily. Natalie. That is, abandonment of a dependent adult. The truth settled like ice in my lungs. I had excused Mason's behavior for years. Now it was impossible to excuse anything at all. When I walked back into the living room, Daniel was awake, eyes clearer than before. He lifted a hand, silently asking me to come closer. Be careful, he whispered. They want me to sign the wrong admission. I asked why, and his answer broke whatever was left of my illusions. They want me to take the blame for the Wyoming collapse, so Linda won't face investigation. The line between suspicion and certainty vanished. They weren't just careless. They were orchestrating his downfall. Night pressed in hard when Daniel's pain spiked. His grip tightened on my shirt as he fought for breath. Don't sign anything. Find Helen. The desperation in his voice made my chest ache. I began recording, not out of fear for myself, but to protect what he needed to say. He managed to explain that the document Linda wanted would pin the bridge disaster on him, even though he'd warned her about the structural issues years earlier. I'd seen too many people exploit the weak in my line of work, but never like this. Using a dying man as a shield felt monstrous. I reached for my laptop to contact Helen. When I returned, Daniel had straightened himself with surprising strength. There's more. he whispered. My trust fund? It isn't hers. I stared. Then who? He met my eyes with a quiet certainty. The one who stayed. You! The words stunned me. I stepped into the kitchen for a few seconds, needing air. But when I came back, his head had slumped forward. His pulse was fading under my fingertips. I whispered to him, begging him to stay with me. His hand lifted just long enough to press a cold metal object into mine, the Wyoming Bridge keychain. What you need is in the letter. Don't let them destroy it. Then he was gone. Grief swallowed me, but only briefly. Everything he entrusted to me had to be protected. I set my hand on his shoulder, promising silently that I would not fail him. My phone buzzed. A flight alert appeared. The Palm Springs to Denver flight has been delayed due to the storm. They were already coming home. They didn't know he was dead. They didn't know what I'd uncovered. And I was finally ready for the truth to meet them at the door. The storm beat against the windows hard enough to make the walls shiver as I arranged everything in the living room. Daniel's files, the structural plans, the printed emails, the receipts from Palm Springs and Las Vegas, the photos of Mason in the desert bar, the recording device, and finally, the small Wyoming Bridge keychain he'd pressed into my palm. Daniel's urn sat in the center like a silent witness. Helen arrived wrapped in a long brown coat, her presence steady and sharp. She told me to hold my ground, to remember we weren't here for rage, but for truth. I nodded, though my heart slammed like a warning bell in my chest. The door swung open. Mason entered first, tan from the California sun, laughing at something Jenna said behind him. Linda followed, polished as always. Jenna strutted in wearing a crop top despite the 20-degree wind outside. Linda barely scanned the room before complaining I hadn't cleaned. None of them realized what sat on the table, or that Daniel was gone. Then Mason saw the urn. His smile vanished. What happened? You weren't here to know, I said. Linda rushed forward, accusing me of negligence until I handed her the bottle of cheap vitamins she and Mason had substituted for Daniel's medication. Her face flickered in recognition. Helen opened her laptop, and the TV lit with doorbell camera footage. Mason and Linda leading Daniel outside in thin sleepwear, leaving him shaking on the porch before driving off. Linda stammered excuses. Mason tried to pull me aside, but I shut him down. You don't get that anymore. I projected the bar photo next. Mason with Jenna, captioned, My guy. Soon to be free. Mason turned white. Jenna shrugged, claiming he'd told her he was almost divorced. Helen pulled out a sealed envelope from Daniel. Linda cried theatrically, and Mason shouted everything belonged to him because he was the son, not the one he trusted. I answered. Snow pressed harder against the windows, as if bracing for the collapse of everything they'd built. By the time the roads closed, no one could leave. Helen placed a speaker on the table and played Daniel's trembling voice as he described the pressure to sign documents, admitting guilt he didn't bear. How Mason and Linda pushed him toward it, how they replaced his medication to cut costs. Mason insisted the audio was fake. Helen corrected him calmly, noting the metadata was untouched. I laid Daniel's real signature beside the coerced one. The difference was unmistakable. Helen declared the forced will invalid. The legal heir was someone else entirely. Linda's composure cracked. I told her Daniel's estate didn't belong to fear. It belonged to truth. Then Helen revealed the emails Linda had hidden. Warnings about the Wyoming Bridge, messages she ignored to save money, proof she scrubbed records after 2 people died. The room fell silent. I placed the Wyoming keychain on the table. Jenna whispered what it meant, and I told her Daniel kept it to remember engineering was about people, not profit. Linda broke into frantic tears. Helen dismissed her excuses without hesitation. Daniel's final recorded words played next. They think I'm alone. I'm not. I have Natalie. Mason shouted he'd been confused. I answered that Daniel had been clearer than anyone in this house. Helen opened the last envelope. Daniel had named me the sole steward of his trust, responsible for finishing his work with integrity. Mason staggered. Linda nearly fell. Jenna quietly backed away and left. The storm outside howled, but inside, every lie had finally been stripped to bone. I stood where Daniel intended me to stand, in possession of the truth he'd fought to leave behind. The blizzard sealed every exit, forcing all of us into a room that suddenly felt too small for the truth inside it. The lights flickered as Daniel's urn stood in the center of the table, surrounded by every piece of evidence they never expected to face. Mason snapped first, tearing the envelope from Helen and shouting that everything in the house belonged to him. I didn't back down. He owned nothing, not even the kindness he'd denied his father. Linda stormed toward me, claiming I knew nothing about what she had done for the family. I slid the Wyoming bridge plans in front of her and told her families weren't built on lies or on the deaths of innocent people. Helen then revealed the internal emails, 3 engineers warning of a collapse, and Linda ignoring them to save money. The weight of it settled like ice. Mason tried to salvage control, insisting we could settle things privately. I played Daniel's last recording, his voice begging me not to let them twist his life. Linda screamed he wasn't lucid. Helen countered with his neurological exam. Then the sheriff called. He had received all the evidence. Jenna slipped out, refusing involvement. Helen read the will naming me trustee. Mason's scream tore through the room, and I stayed standing. The storm eased just enough for cell service to return, and Helen's phone rang first. She put it on speaker, so every corner of the room could hear the county sheriff's voice. He said they needed Linda and her son at the station first thing in the morning. The evidence was overwhelming. The words landed with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel. Linda turned to me in disbelief, tears sliding down her face, begging to know how I could do this to them. I answered with a calm I didn't recognize in myself. I didn't do anything to you. I put the truth where it belonged. Helen stepped beside me, explaining that the documents they had forced on Daniel were now void and would never stand in court. The Wyoming bridge case would be reopened, investigated properly this time. Transparency was what Daniel had deserved, and now it was finally coming. Then Helen opened a file on her laptop and played a video I hadn't known existed. Daniel sat propped up in bed, fighting for breath but unwavering as he spoke into the camera. If someone sees this, I never agreed to take the blame. I only want the truth protected, and I trust Natalie. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt physical. Linda cried harder, but there was no grief in it, only fear. Mason stepped toward me, like a man desperate to salvage something. Nat, we can start over. I made mistakes. I know that. I held his gaze, seeing finally what I'd refused to see for years. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was the man he chose to be. You didn't just make mistakes. You abandoned the person who raised you. I can't fix who you are. Helen reviewed the trust details next. The house belonged entirely to Daniel's estate, and Daniel's estate now fell under the trust I controlled. Mason and Linda would need to leave as soon as the roads cleared. Mason erupted, shouting that I couldn't kick him out of his own home. I pointed to the urn at the center of the table. This was his home, and he chose me to protect it. His expression collapsed into something small and lost, but it didn't move me. Helen gathered the paperwork, and the storm outside began to quiet, as if the house had finally exhaled. I slipped my wedding ring from my finger and placed it in Mason's hand. For a moment, he just stared at it, as if shocked that something so small could close an entire marriage. I'm done, I told him. I stepped out of your life the night you stepped over your father's. His knees buckled. Linda stared at the table, realizing the game she had played for years was finally over, and for the first time since I walked into that frozen house, the truth stood exactly where it belonged. By the time morning broke, the storm had thinned into a quiet veil, leaving the world washed clean. Inside the house, everything felt strangely still, as if the walls themselves had finally exhaled. I gathered my EMS gear, my warm jacket, and the envelope Daniel had entrusted to Helen, now resting firmly in my hands. Stepping outside, I felt the crunch of fresh snow beneath my boots. A soft, I could finally move forward. I lingered in the yard, turning the Wyoming bridge keychain between my fingers. Its glint in the winter light carried a warmth that didn't belong to metal. I looked back at the house one last time, the place where I'd once placed all my hopes, where truth had been smothered, and where, at last, every lie had been forced into daylight. It no longer held me. Helen joined me briefly, laying a steady hand on my shoulder. "Daniel would be proud of you." Her voice held no doubt. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into my chest. I started the car and pointed it toward Wyoming. Landslide played on the radio, quiet but resolute. "Daniel, I'll finish your bridge," I whispered. And then I drove, into light, into freedom, into what comes next.